Hello and welcome. I am so glad that you have joined me today. We'll be studying the book of Nehemiah, but today we're only going to be just covering the introduction and the background to the book, and next week we will actually look verse by verse through chapter 1. So grab yourself a cup of tea and we'll get started. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, even provide a comment. It helps with the algorithm to get out to more people. So a bit of a biblical history before what happened in the book of Nehemiah. So even though the book of Nehemiah, it appears sort of in the first half of the Old Testament Bible, it, along with Ezra and the book of Esther, it records events more toward the end of Old Testament history, starting about 445 BC. So some 800 years after the time of Moses, the Israelite nations that were destroyed, first it was the northern kingdom of Israel at 722 BC, and then the southern kingdom, the Jewish kingdom of Judah in the year 586. Babylon had conquered Jerusalem and took many of the Jews captive, transporting them in exile to Babylon. The city of Jerusalem was completely conquered by the Babylonians, and the one glorious temple of Solomon is destroyed. God allowed this captivity as judgment for the Israelites' disobedience. We can see that in 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 1 to 9. But he also promised through the prophet Jeremiah, some 200 years before Nehemiah, to restore them back to their land. We can see that in Jeremiah 25, verses 11 to 12. You can look those verses up for yourself. When the Babylons conquered Jerusalem, they deported almost everyone from the city and the region for some 70 years. In Jerusalem, it was something of a ghost town at that time, with the potential to end up, like many ancient cities, completely forgotten except to history. And when the Jews were deported to Babylon, they began to make homes for themselves there. They lived in Babylon, as Jeremiah had told them to do in Jeremiah 29, verses 4 to 7. They settled down, and many still followed God of their forefathers, but they did it from Babylon, with no desire to return to the land God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So you can read Jeremiah 29 verses 4 to 7 yourself. In 539 BC, the Babylonians were defeated by the Persians, who took over their empire, and the Persians were kinder and a gentler empire compared to the Babylonians. And so their policy was to let the captive people return to their homelands. And the Persians allowed the Jewish exiles to return back to Jerusalem. And so a number of Jews, they returned to Judah, while others still stayed in Babylon. And many of the captive Jews, they had settled in new homes in Babylon and in Persia. So some like Daniel and later sort of Esther and Ruth. They obtained positions, and some of them even obtained positions of prominence in the empire. So that was like Daniel, and Esther, and here Nehemiah. And after 70 years of captivity in Babylonian, they were given the opportunity to return to their homeland, the Promised Land. Out of some of the 2 or 3 million Jews deported from the land, only about 50,000 returned. So you can see that in Ezra 2, and they decided to return to the Promised Land. And this is only something like just a very small amount, like 2%. And most captives chose to stay in Babylon rather than return to their homeland. And so these people who did choose to return, they went back in 3 groups. First, in 538 BC, there was about 40 to 50,000 Jews that returned under Zerubbabel's leadership in Ezra 1 to 6. And with the aid of King Darius of Persia, they were able to rebuild the temple. They were able to lay the spiritual foundation for Israel once again, which was completed in 515 BC. And decades went by with some Jews firmly rooted in Persia, while others were back in Judah, struggling to reclaim their land. In 520 BC, Zechariah, they prophesied that the temple would be rebuilt and Jerusalem would be measured and filled again with prosperity. You can see that in Zechariah 1 verses 16 to 17. Then a little bit later, in 479 BC, Esther, she becomes queen of Persia and thwarted the evil plan to destroy the Jewish people. About 20 years later, Ezra led the second expedition of about 5,000 people to Jerusalem. And the citizens of Jerusalem had tried to rebuild the walls there, but they had failed. In Ezra chapter 4, we see that some 75 years earlier, they tried to rebuild the walls, but they were stopped by the enemies. No one thought this obstacle could be overcome, so the walls just laid in ruin and the people remained exposed. So 12 to 14 years had passed with no progress made to rebuild the temple wall. And so Nehemiah had the position in the royal court of King Artaxerxes of Persia. And a messenger arrives with a report from Judah, and so the story of Nehemiah begins. So just an overview of the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah's life sets a powerful example. As the chapters progress, we watch him work his way through different job assignments, from a cupbearer of a pagan king to a general contractor of a massive reconstruction project to a governor. He goes back to being a cupbearer, and then he's finally governor again. Through all these changes, there's one thing that remains with Nehemiah. He remains a man of integrity. Whenever he finds to do, he does it with all of his heart, as if he is serving God, as if God was his employer. And we see this sort of reflected in the New Testament in Colossians chapter 2, verse 23. Whatever you do, work with all your heart, as if working for the Lord and not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord God you are serving. So Nehemiah, he was both a thoughtful man and a man of prayer and a passionate man of action. It's a rare combination. He must have been exceptionally trustworthy to secure the position of the cupbearer of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, as was Daniel, who was also exiled with great authority under a pagan king. When he heard that the walls of Jerusalem had crumbled, Nehemiah, he didn't take rash action by trying to take matters into his own hands. Instead, he devoted himself to prayer and fasting, quietly waiting on God to move the heart of the king. But once he saw that God was at work, he didn't hesitate to take bold requests for assistance from King Artaxerxes. Nehemiah not only recognized the problem, but he was willing to be part of the solution, even though it meant uprooting his entire life and walking away from this influential government position to live in the dangerous, unprotected city of Jerusalem. So that's all I have for you, just for the introduction of Nehemiah. Next week we will go through verse by verse of Nehemiah chapter 1. And so again, it's been a pleasure spending time with you, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.